Hello, welcome to the University of Brighton podcast. I'm Richard Newman. This is episode 112 of the podcast, which catches up with academic staff and students at the university to chat to them about their work. My guest this week is Dr. Holly Chard, Senior Lecturer in Contemporary Screen Media. Holly's main research interest is on the films of the late John Hughes. She's written a book about him too. Now, I'm a huge fan of his films. I'm sure many of you are too. And with Christmas around the corner, this is just the right time to talk about him. So Holly, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's great to have you on.
Thank you, Richard.
So as always, we start the podcast by just getting to know you a little bit better. So can you tell us a little bit about your background and your work at the uni?
Yeah, of course. So as you've said, I'm a lecturer in contemporary screen media. I teach mainly on the BA Honours Film course, which is a course that combines a mixture of kind of practice and kind of hands-on filmmaking with learning about the kind of contemporary film industry, a bit of film theory and analysis as well. And I kind of teach the theory analysis and industry stuff on that course, which is brilliant. We get a really great mix of students on that. So that's kind of day to day what I do. And like you say, I've just had my book about John Hughes come out, and a lot of my research is really about kind of popular culture, and particularly American films and TV since the 1980s. That's kind of what I'm really interested in, and always love talking about with people.
Yeah, great. Really interesting course for you to teach on too. I mean, for anyone that is thinking about coming to the university, what is it about Brighton that stands out for you?
Okay, I think obviously one of the strengths of the course is the mix of kind of theoretical learning and production. But in terms of Brighton itself, it's a brilliant city to be a student in. There's so much to do. It's also a brilliant city to be a filmmaker in as well. There's lots of creative people, lots of events happening all the time. Obviously, at the moment, a few events aren't kind of happening, but in general, lots going on. Also great in terms of shooting locations for filmmaking. You've got the beach, you can go down to the cliffs, you've got the countryside, you've got city, you've got suburbs, you've got modern buildings, Victorian, etc. So it's like a really great place to be making movies, connecting with people, and kind of just growing up and getting to know who you are and what kind of filmmaker you want to be, or maybe what other kind of areas of film or media you might be interested in kind of pursuing after uni.
Yeah, great. So your interest in John Hughes, you've written the book Mainstream Maverick, John Hughes and New Hollywood Cinema. Where does your interest in him stem from?
Okay, so the first thing to say is this is a project that had an incredibly long gestation period. So I started researching John Hughes when I did my master's, which was in 2007, 2008, so quite a long time ago. And I kind of started looking at his films because I by accident was looking at a lot of the kind of family films and comedies I liked as a kid on IMDb. And I noticed that the same writer and often producer, John Hughes, was attached to them. And I thought, this is kind of interesting, okay. And it kind of spun out from there, really. And obviously he's really well known for his teen films. But for me, as a kind of older millennial, it's like the films like Home Alone and stuff that kind of really introduced me to his work. So that's kind of how it started. It's obviously been over a decade, which is terrifying when I think about it. Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's just fueled by my interest in kind of basically the movies that people actually watch and the movies that people kind of remember and have become kind of part of the fabric of our culture and our lives. And a lot of people know these films and have really fond memories of them. So it's kind of looking at it from a more academic perspective.
Yeah, I think from just from an enjoyment point of view, I think as an older millennial myself, exactly the same. I think you watch John Hughes and Miracle on 34th Street when you're a kid. You think that is the Miracle on 34th Street, obviously, and then as you get older, like going through his back catalogue and just so much stuff. Which we're going to come to in a minute, but obviously we're recording this on the 1st of December, so we can now legitimately feel a bit Christmassy. So what is it about this? There's a massive association with John Hughes and Christmas. Home Alone, Miracle on 34th Street, the remake with Richard Attenborough, National Lampoon, Even like last week it was Thanksgiving, and you've got Planes, Trains and Automobiles. It's got a real association with this time of year in general, hasn't he? He's sort of become part of the festive furniture.
Absolutely, yeah. And even the films that aren't set at Christmas or in the holidays, they tend to be shown around this time of year as well. And I think a couple of reasons, I would say. Firstly, a lot of his films from the late 80s onwards were about families. And obviously the festive season is a time where families come together, and you can generate an awful lot of kind of humour from that, as we'll probably talk about. And also a lot of nice, heartwarming sentiment, which is one of the kind of key features of a lot of his movies. It's like they always have a nice, happy ending. And also he was very commercially savvy and basically realised if you set a film at Thanksgiving or at Christmas, it will be shown on TV every single year. And so there was a kind of commercial angle to this too, basically, of figuring out, oh, okay, actually, these films will have a really long legacy on TV and at the time video and then DVD and stuff. So yeah, there's a kind of multiple reasons why this happened, but yeah, it's really interesting they've still endured.
But I mean, it's all very well having that idea and knowing that it could be that could work, but if we really go back through the last 30 years or so, how many really good Christmas films are there, and then how many of them end up having an association with John Hughes? It's not easy to make a good Christmas film.
No, I mean, I think obviously Elf is probably the one that stands out to me as kind of one of the ones that's got.
But even that was that like status. 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're kind of few and far between. And I think, like clearly it's not. It's a weird alchemy, and we maybe talk about this in relation to Home Alone. Like there's a lot of different elements that kind of came together. Some that I think were rooted in his and his collaborators' talents, some that were kind of a little bit right place, right time, managing to kind of bring it all together as well.
Let's talk about Home Alone now then, shall we? Because I think it's obviously, I think for a lot of people, that's his most famous film. Just a huge success, and obviously went on to several sequels, and we're going to get another one as well, which I'll get your thoughts on in a moment. One of the I can't think of many films that don't need to be remade, but there is one. But what is it about everything that came together with Home Alone that made that such a success?
I mean, there are so many brilliant interviews with the people who worked on it, both kind of at the time, but in recent times, because obviously we've had the 30-year anniversary in November when it came out. And I think you've got John Hughes, who wrote it and he produced it, and he was very adamant about getting it made. So it's famously one of those movies where Warner Brothers were the original studio and basically had a big argument with Hughes and the director Chris Columbus over the budget. They wanted them to cut it by $2 million, and they just said, no, we can't make the film we want to make. So they went to 20th Century Fox, and then it went on to become this massive hit. So very famous for that aspect. But I think in terms of the kind of story elements and it all coming together, you've got, let's say, Hughes, the writer and producer, who by this point had already been very successful with his teen films, but also kind of more, I guess, family films and comedy films with things like Uncle Buck, Planes, Trains and Automobiles, that kind of thing. Chris Columbus, who as a director wasn't hugely experienced, but had also written films like The Goonies under the kind of mentorship of Steven Spielberg. So you've got a director who's very good at working with young performers as well. That's why they chose him, Chris Columbus, to direct the first Harry Potter film. You've then also got brilliant production designer John Muto, who creates that whole kind of very festive aesthetic of the film, which I think still looks really good, even though it's like it's 30 years old. And the other person that really, well, there's two other people off the top of my head that really deserve credit. Julio Macat, who is the cinematographer on the film, and again was a big part of like the aesthetic of it looking nice and having that kind of child's perspective on Christmas and on the kind of events of the film. And then finally, the big thing I think is Freddie Heiss, who is the stunt coordinator on the movie. And like Home Alone would be nothing without all of that slapstick, particularly in the kind of final sort of climactic bit of the film where he sets up all the booby traps and stuff. And apparently all of the people kind of making the film at the time said they felt there was something about it, like it all just sort of came together, and you had some great performers in it as well. And it just it worked. And that's so rare in Hollywood. Like, they have so many ideas that seem brilliant on paper,
Yeah.
and then become massive flops. And then you've got this movie that was made for less than sort of $20 million, and then it goes on to become the highest grossing comedy of all time. And yeah, it took a lot of people by surprise, but actually in hindsight, all those ingredients were there.
How much of it as well comes down to getting a bit lucky with the casting of Macaulay Culkin, because I mean, you can't imagine any other kid doing it, and it's him that kind of makes it, really, doesn't it, to sort of stitch it all together.
Yeah, I think, and that was that was like partly luck, partly Hughes had worked with him on Uncle Buck, where he played John Candy's nephew, and there was a particular scene where he does that kind of interrogation of John Candy and asks him with fire questions.
Yeah.
And that was one of the scenes that kind of stuck with John Hughes. And they did all these auditions for Kids for Home Alone. And then it was kind of like, actually, Macaulay Culkin is the best fit. And he was quite experienced by then as well, relatively speaking, in terms of working on films. But he does just have a kind of charisma. Certainly at that age. I think it kind of wanes as he gets older, and he becomes a bit less cute.
Yeah.
I think there's a kind of an element of how kind of cute and innocent he looks, and that obviously juxtaposed with him blowtorching Joe Pesci and stuff like that. But yeah, and he by all accounts was sort of very good at taking on board direction and, you know, working with the adults in the film as well. So
yeah. And
Joe Pesci was banned from swearing, which is
really
hard. This is why he makes all those kind of like noises that are like really angry but aren't actual swear words.
Yeah, they almost sound like sort of cartoony, don't they? The sort of the sounds he makes. We're gonna have a focus a little bit later on about the John Hughes sort of more earlier work in terms of the stuff that really set him up, the teen films. And just sticking with the sort of more family films that he was making at this point, and all the Christmas films that he was making. There's a real it feels, a lot of the films, they don't feel like the same film, but they all feel very similar, or that they're really related to each other. You said about Uncle Buck there with Macaulay Culkin, it just feels like the Home Alone film you can watch at any time of year, Uncle Buck.
Yeah.
And then Planes, Trains and Automobiles feels like one, like it's kind of like a more adult version of Home Alone. This again, it's a bit slapstick, but it's for adults with swearing in it, especially that fantastic scene with the car rental.
Absolutely.
But they do kind of all have a similar kind of style, don't they? Had a very distinct writing style.
Yeah, I think like he definitely has a kind of like you say, clear sort of approach to stories and to characters, and then kind of style of comedy that he tends to lean towards. I think Planes, Trains and Automobiles is actually brilliant in terms of a lot of the dialogue, and it kind of reminiscent of a lot of like screwball comedy, and kind of particularly the interaction between Steve Martin and John Candy throughout the film. That kind of back and forth odd couple dynamic on the road is brilliant. And as I've already sort of touched on, I think it's that ability as well to kind of tap into sentiment, which sometimes verges on sentimentality, but kind of delivers on that kind of heartwarming side of things as well. And I think that was really helped, particularly in the films with John Candy, with him as a star. He's very kind of sympathetic. He's someone that people root for as well, I think. And yeah, again, there's a kind of alchemy that happens when you get these kind of collaborations in kind of films. And again, Hughes was very good at kind of figuring out what worked, and then kind of recycling it. And I don't mean that in like necessarily a disparaging way, but he kind of identified, well, this is what people like about my movies, this is what entertains them, we'll do more of the same. And you know, in interviews he said that was part of his strategy. He wants people, if they're going to see a John Hughes film, he wants them to get a John Hughes film.
Yeah. Just while we come back to the sort of family values bit in just a moment, while we're just touching on John Candy, I mean, like Hughes, died fairly young. And everyone loves John Candy, don't they? That they watch. I mean, he's like you say, you can root for him. You always feel sorry for him, but he's also stupidly funny. What was it about him that made him so talented? And do you think he would have gone on to continue doing very similar work?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, really hard question to answer. I think he from what you can, because obviously you don't know what celebrities are like in real life, but from what you can tell of John Candy, whenever he did interviews on stuff like Letterman and things, he was an incredibly sort of modest, self-deprecating guy. He was very Canadian, by which I mean he sort of was very proud of his Canadian identity. He invested in like a hockey team. He did his own radio show in Canada and stuff. And he kind of always managed to keep this sort of like everyman guy you can invite around for a beer kind of vibe, even when he was hugely famous. He never really seemed very kind of Hollywood, or indeed very comfortable with being famous. And I think that's kind of part of what, I guess, from what I understand, again, you'd have to ask his kind of people who knew him, but he kind of struggled with that. And I think that was a factor in kind of the health problems he had and so on. So it's really hard to sort of say what would have happened. I mean, I think it's interesting that you have kind of similar performers like John Goodman, who've kind of graduated to these more kind of elder statesman kind of roles and do a mixture of comedy and serious stuff. So I think perhaps if he had kind of, you know, lived to now, he'd probably be more in that kind of area, playing potentially the grandfather now rather than just the dad or the uncle. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people have speculated that Candy's death was one of the reasons why Hughes stepped away from Hollywood in the late 90s, because he kind of felt like he'd lost his friend who really struggled with kind of the fame of it all. Yeah.
We're going to come back to that as well a little bit later about where John Hughes sort of finishing his career in Hollywood sort of fairly early. Let's go back to Christmas.
We keep forgetting it's the Christmas one.
No, because it's just so many interesting things. I find it really interesting. Miracle on 34th Street, which is an incredibly popular festive favourite. Black and white film, obviously originally, and you know, almost. It's very you can kind of watch them side by side, and they're quite similar. But then there's kind of John Hughesy bits in the Miracle on 30, the newer version of it with Richard Attenborough. Again, just like incredible casting where if you sort of close your eyes and picture a real Father Christmas, it's probably Richard Attenborough, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that is the old, again, just really focusing on like his incredible ability to capture that festive spirit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what was quite interesting is, like you say, the story fundamentally stays the same. And there's a few kind of Hughesy elements. There's a bit of slapstick. He kind of changed the ending, which is quite interesting, actually. Maybe come back to that. But Richard Attenborough was, I can't think of better casting in that role. And also, I think a moment that a lot of people remember is the one with the girl who's deaf, and he does the sign language. And apparently that they hadn't told the little girl, the little actress who came in to do that, who was deaf in real life, that he was going to do that. And so all of that reaction is genuine. And it's like, he obviously had a real talent as an actor for kind of getting that emotional connection with the other people on set as well. And him and Mara Wilson as well, the main little girl in the film, who is now awesome adult. You should follow her on Twitter. Her book's brilliant as well. Again, they have a real connection, and to me, totally, like in my mind, Father Christmas is Richard Attenborough. And
it's just that it almost goes back to what we were talking about with John Candy. He obviously likes to work with people who you can root for, and you almost feel an element of feeling almost like sorry for them. You just want to go and give them a hug, don't you? So it's John Candy, Richard Attenborough. It's even working with people like Robin Williams later on, like Flubber, which is not the best film in my mind, but but anyway, but it's kind of the similar kind of thing. He works with these big names that that you kind of really you do root for.
And I think it's probably testament to his kind of talents as a writer and a producer, that he managed to get all these people on board to make his films. And there was obviously something in it for them as performers. You know, they obviously felt like they could do something with the work and the kind of characters that he'd given them. And by all accounts, when he was directing, and obviously he didn't actually direct that many films,
No.
like he didn't actually direct Miracle on 34th Street or the Home Alone films, for example, but when he did, he would let the actors kind of workshop things. He'd just let the camera roll. He was notoriously bad for recording loads and loads and loads of footage, and then kind of basically giving the film shape in the edit. So he'd always been very kind of centered on performers and giving them what they needed and giving them enough freedom with the script and the characters to kind of develop it as well, which also I think is a factor with John Candy. Like, he would just let Candy improvise on certain scenes and kind of develop what he'd kind of set in motion, and kind of stood back and just let him, you know, do what he could do.
Going back to the end of Miracle on 34th Street, then, when you said the changing the ending, you said you was to come back to that. What were your thoughts on that?
Oh, so in the original, the way they prove that Santa Claus is real is that he's recognized by the US Postal Service, and that's kind of like the legal argument they make is he's recognized by the US Postal Service, therefore he is a real person, who is him. John Hughes' version does something different. It kind of taps much more into a kind of, I would say, Christian kind of belief in faith. Basically, there's quite a touching speech that Richard Attenborough's character gives to Elizabeth Perkins' character, which is about, you know, you can't take things on faith. What's the point? And the whole kind of climax of the film is all these different people putting up posters and signs, including major corporations, incidentally. The religious thing happens where basically Mara Wilson, very cute in the court, walks up to the judge with a Christmas card, and in it there's a dollar bill, and encircled, God we trust. And so they're basically like, if the US Treasury can say that we believe in God and we trust in God, then we can believe in Father Christmas. And that's kind of like the takeaway of the film. Yes, with Hughes is kind of broadly middle American, sort of small C conservative values, that he went for that kind of angle of faith and kind of, as to say, a kind of Christian angle, the legal kind of argument for Father Christmas.
National Lampoon, that's one I can't get on board with as much, and I don't know why. I don't know whether it's because it's a bit too slapsticky for me, or whether it always feels like a grown up version of Home Alone without it being funny enough for me. And I don't know why it is, because I love every single John Hughes film, and National Lampoon I just don't get. Is there something different about it or not, or is it just me?
Yeah, I think so. No, I think obviously the style of humor of National Lampoon, if we go back to like the original Vacation, which was 1983, which is kind of one of Hughes' breakthrough films as a screenwriter, it's kind of a lot cruder. It's a kind of quite a kind of bro frat boy kind of humor, the original Vacation. And some of it's actually quite mean as well in the original film, in terms of who they're laughing at. By the Christmas Vacation film, it's kind of, I think it falls between two stools. Like, it's trying to be a bit more family friendly, but at the same time kind of has some of that sort of like slightly more outlandish National Lampoon humor. And I think Chevy Chase was kind of at a point in his career where he was kind of phoning it in, to be honest. And Hughes had very little to do with the actual production. He basically wrote the screenplay and stuck his name on it as a producer, and just kind of let them get on with it and make it. And it's all filmed on a studio lot as well. So there's like no authentic locations. You'll notice that even though it's supposed to be freezing cold, and then like there's no like breath in the air or anything like that. It looks very stagey. And I think it just doesn't know who its audience are. You can see the Hughesian elements in terms of like the family dysfunction and the sort of slightly neurotic kind of father figure who's kind of gradually descending into madness as Christmas approaches. And actually, I think as well, like cousin Eddie, who is the kind of trailer trash relative who has that line that I probably can't say on the podcast, that's quite iconic, when he's emptying the toilet from his RV, has kind of gone from this kind of satirical character to this kind of hillbilly kind of comedy figure. It doesn't all hold together brilliantly. I mean, I like elements of it. I do kind of like the final scene where the SWAT team jumps in the house and you know, it all kind of gets really chaotic. But yeah, I see what you mean. Like, I don't think it's not really a proper family film. I wouldn't feel comfortable showing it to kids. And then at the same time, it doesn't have the depth to really kind of be a film for adults either. It's kind of neither one thing nor the other. And as I say, I think Chevy Chase was better in some of his earlier work. And yeah, I think it's quite there's something missing. And I think also, even when it tries to sort of bring in the sentiment, it just feels really cloying and forced, like at the end of the film. Or there's a bit where Chevy Chase reads, you know, 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, and we're supposed to be on board with it, and it's just, it doesn't land at all.
No, I agree.
So yeah, and it's kind of, it came out around the same time as Uncle Buck as well, which kind of hits the mark much more. And I think it's kind of an interesting contrast really there.
Yeah, it's my cousin's favourite Christmas film. I don't agree with her. I don't quite get it. Just in general, how much does the American dream sort of feature in these films? The common theme seems to be these are all mainly rich white men being the main characters in this, living in huge houses. Often with big families as well. I mean, these houses are just insane, aren't they? Especially the Home Alone house. But kind of, I guess all of them, again, back to Planes, Trains, Automobiles, it looks like exactly the same house, doesn't it? And again, maybe even in National Lampoon's Christmas, like that looked pretty similar. So it's always very similar. It's kind of, he's always it always looks the same. It's always the same sort of focus.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like a very much a kind of filmmaker of suburban America, and he really taps into that kind of American post-war suburban kind of imagery. But like you say, actually, as his films go on, the characters seem to get richer and richer. And like, Uncle Buck, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Home Alone, they all live in these enormous houses in they're Chicago's North Shore suburbs, so they are very affluent, very white. Kind of places, and his films in general are very white racially, and I think the American dream in terms of wealth and the kind of aspirations around that is very much on display. Also, like you say, the kind of family values aspect of it as well, of like, these are not just families with parents and kids, but they seem to have loads of kids and all this kind of extended family as well. You tend not to see kind of alternatives to that. The only film that you do see that in that's well known of Hughes's films that's really visible is Curly Sue. But the whole point of that film, which is about a young girl who's kind of homeless and is kind of a grifter with her kind of we don't really know if he's her dad, he's just her caregiver, I guess, and he's also homeless, and they're kind of conning everyone. It's kind of a rip-off of Paper Moon with Tate O'Neill, but anyway, but in that film it's like, it's a single parent family, essentially non-conventional family, but the whole drive of the movie is to kind of make a traditional family and for them to then move in with the really rich loyal woman. And it's kind of like that is very much set up as the ideal. Same in Miracle on 34th Street, to be fair. Single mother who, you know, we understand from the dialogue, ex-husband who was an alcoholic who left her, and it's all about getting her together with Dylan McDermott's character and like literally getting her to a church and getting her married. And then at the end as well, it's like what Father Christmas gets them is this like again, this enormous, ridiculously expensive suburban house filled with loads of expensive stuff. And that is very much like, it's not even a subtext in the films. It's very much foregrounded of like, yeah, this is the American dream. It's a big family. It's a big house. It's nice stuff. Definitely, yeah.
Going back to Home Alone. First, just something we talked about off air, but when we were preparing for this, is again, you've talked about already, is that he was really good at marketing films and picking the right times of year to make them. So they're very commercially successful, but also in terms of the sort of merchandise that came with it. The Home Alone 2 is basically the same film as Home Alone, the original film, but the sort of, what was the cassette, sort of the
cassette player,
that I mean, it became a big thing, and it actually lasted for a little bit longer, didn't it? Because I was too young for Home Alone 2 probably when it first came out, just about, but I can remember having a second wave and wanting it for Christmas.
So basically, originally the film, Hughes had worked in advertising before he went into movies, so he had that way of thinking about things. And with Home Alone 2, like you say, it's more or less, it was at the time called a kind of carbon copy. You just move it to New York, and that's kind of what gives the novelty, and everything's bigger. But with the Talkboy cassette recorder, that was part of a partnership with Tiger Electronics and Games, which were a company based in Chicago and Illinois, that made kids' toys, particularly electronic games, and they came up with this cassette player recorder thing. And not only is it featured in the film, it's actually very much crucial to several plot points. So the reason he gets separated from his parents at the airport is he's putting batteries into the toy. The reason he gets booked into the Plaza Hotel is he uses the voice manipulation on it to check in over the phone. He then manages to record the confession of the wet bandits that they're going to steal their charity money and kill him on it. And it becomes this kind of like really crucial part of the story. And at the time, it was massively controversial, very much attacked by a lot of parents groups. There were a lot of comment pieces in newspapers that were very much against this kind of, basically it is product placement, but it was very much embedded into the narrative. However, kids loved it. And like you say, it was one of the kind of top 10 Christmas toys for several years afterwards, kind of the late 90s. And they obviously brought out different versions as well. So they kind of had the original Talk Boys, and then the Talk Boy Deluxe, and then they did the Talk Girl that was like pink, and then they did the pens and the watch, and they kind of managed to spin that out for probably the best part of a decade, truth be told. And I think one of the reasons it works as well, though, is it does have a practical function. Like if you're buying your kids an expensive toy that's from a movie, at least this could play cassettes and could record stuff, like it did something. And I think that was part of why it was successful as well. It's like not just a bit of plastic.
Yeah, I wonder whether Kevin grew up to become an audio and video editor, because he has an uncanny knack of being able to rewind back to exactly the right point, doesn't he? Just before we move on, then, about Home Alone and the remake that they're bringing out soon. Is it next year? Maybe. I think it was meant to be. Was it meant to be this year originally?
It was meant to be this year.
Yeah, but the pandemic, and like for a 30th anniversary, can't think of a worse 30th anniversary present than remaking a film that doesn't need to be remade. But what are your thoughts on it? Is it gonna work?
Probably not. I always think it's a bad idea to remake films that have kind of classic status. I just think you're setting yourself up for a fall. Although that's somewhat ironic given what we were saying about Miracle on 34th Street. But I think also it's not surprising in that one of the reasons Disney bought 20th Century Fox was to buy all of their intellectual property and all of the rights to their successful films and TV shows. And so one of the first things Disney's basically done is they've gone, okay, what from the back catalogue that we've bought from Fox was successful. Okay, how can we do things with that and see if we can reboot these kind of IPs? So in that sense, in terms of kind of contemporary Hollywood's business practices, it's not remotely surprising. But I doubt it will be successful. Nearly everyone involved in the original has said it's a terrible idea.
Yeah.
Don't remake it.
Yeah.
And I think as well, like, again, it's just, as I said, there were all these different elements that came together, and I consider it highly unlikely that that same kind of bringing together of the kind of the sum of the parts is much,
Yeah.
what am I trying to say?
Yeah,
Mixing metaphor.
Yeah,
You know what I
it'll be
mean?
interesting to see how it works. I was just trying to have a look through the cast now, and Rob Delaney is a funny guy, and Eddie Kemper's brilliant in The Office, but I just can't see. We won't even have the John Williams music either. Okay, so I want to go back further then to the teen films that he made. Just how much did he change the way that those kind of films are made, or created that kind of genre?
Yeah. I mean, he is widely credited in kind of completely reorienting the genre, really. Historically, teen films had kind of been male dominated. Like, when you think about the kind of ones that stick out from like the 50s, like Rebel Without a Cause or The Wild One, or kind of going into the sort of 70s and 80s with like the sort of horror films and sex comedies and stuff. It, like something like Porky's, which was kind of it's all about guys trying to have sex with girls. There just weren't very many films that were told from a female point of view, or that had male characters that were particularly likable or sympathetic. And so kind of one of the breakthroughs really with films like 16 Candles with Molly Ringwald, and then The Breakfast Club and Pretty in Pink and those kind of movies, was that you had kind of the female characters that were interesting, that were allowed to sort of have opinions and do things, and it kind of wasn't about sex necessarily, it was often about romance. You've also got kind of more sympathetic, geeky male characters, particularly played by Anthony Michael Hall, who, for a long time, if you were academic in kind of one of these films, you would just be like a stereotypical nerd with like big glasses, and you're the butt of the joke. Whereas his films were kind of much more thoughtful, and much more concerned with kind of moving beyond a lot of sort of teenage stereotypes. And I think that's why particularly The Breakfast Club is kind of still very much celebrated as a kind of breakthrough movie, just in terms of its it's five kids just talking to each other basically for the whole film. It's kind of more like a play than a movie in a lot of ways.
It's a very it feels like a very John Hughes film and a very Richard Linklater film in the same way. They both had their very obvious stamp on them, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of it's what I find interesting is obviously there were kind of limitations of what he did. So although he broke kind of ground in terms of, as I say, the female characters and the geeky male characters and stuff, and kind of having teenagers that have feelings, obviously they were still all very white, very suburban, very American. But what I think is really interesting is that then in the last like 20 years, loads of indie filmmakers and filmmakers kind of working in less commercial movies have referenced him as an influence. So like Greta Gerwig with Lady Bird, Diablo Cody, when she wrote Juno, basically said like, these films massively influenced me. So what I find interesting is that he kind of created a template that was quite kind of mainstream, but created a few more opportunities, and that people have kind of taken those ideas and run with them and done their own things with them. I think that's probably partly why his kind of influence endures, is that, as I say, the films themselves had an impact at the time, but you can kind of see in so many kind of youth and teen films and TV now, a lot of those kind of tropes and a lot of those characters that you can kind of go back to his work and see.
Hughes died in 2009, is that right? He was 59, but he hadn't been active really for quite a long time before that. Actually, I mean, the body of his work really was in his 20s and 30s, is that right? Most of it, or most of it in his 30s, I guess. Or so do you, is that, you touched on earlier on, is that John Candy death potentially, did that play a big role in that?
I mean, it's kind of cited as one of the factors, but to be honest, I think he just lost interest in it. So basically what happened was he did all these he did Home Alone, that was hugely successful. Home Alone 2 was quite successful. He did other family films that were always trying to like replicate that success, and were often viewed as disappointments at the box office, even though like Miracle on 34th Street, for example, didn't didn't do very well at the box office originally.
Okay.
They even did this offer, like you could get your money back if you didn't like the film.
Right.
To
Okay.
try and get people to go. But it was really successful in video, actually. But basically, he was always trying to write the next Home Alone. It didn't really happen. He partnered up with Disney to do 101 Dalmatians and Flubber, but by that point was essentially kind of sending them the script and doing a bit of the producer stuff, but not hands-on. And then after that, it kind of, there's always rumors that he's going to make such and such a film. So there was a rumor he was going to do some kind of Peter Pan film. There was a rumor he was going to do a film called The Bee, about a man and a bee, and all these other kind of movies that just never happened. And yeah, I think partly he also fell out, by all accounts, with the guy that he set up, Grey Oaks, which was his production company. He had the deal with Disney 3, so that was a factor. But yeah, I get the feeling from kind of interviews so there was a great interview in Vanity Fair after he died, where they spoke to his family and looked at his archive and stuff. Was that he just kind of got fed up with it and decided he would much rather just live in his nice big house in the Chicago suburbs, listen to music, draw, write, and not do it for anyone else. And I think that was it. But I think people kind of assume there must be this like big story behind it. But I think it was just like he just kind of had enough of it, really. But that's my read on it. I mean, the people who know obviously his family, but yeah, certainly they've said his family, John Candy's family, have said like his death was a part of it as well, of him taking that step back from Hollywood and moving. He'd already moved back to Illinois, but he'd kind of decided he wasn't going to move to California again. He wasn't going to become part of that world.
Okay. Okay. So finishing off, what's your favorite John Hughes film?
I have two.
Okay.
Home Alone.
Yeah.
Is still hilarious. And always have to watch it at Christmas. Watching it with particularly my family, my dad and my brother will giggle at Home Alone. And they think it's hilarious, which just makes me laugh because grown men. And then my other favourite film of his teen films is Pretty in Pink, just because it has an amazing soundtrack. And also James Spader is in it and is really, to be totally objective, is really hot in it. And there's a lot of lingering kind of close-ups on James Spader looking really awful and sleazy and preppy, but like so perfectly 1980s. But as I say, it's got this kind of amazing new wave kind of post-punk soundtrack as well. So those are my two favourite John Hughes films. Cool.
It's been really great fun, like going through all these. I could probably talk about this for a lot longer. But hopefully that's got people in the mood to get through some of the Christmas John Hughes back catalogue. Before we go, we finish every podcast with the same questions to every guest just before we finish. First one, what advice would you give to your younger self?
It would probably be to not put so much pressure on yourself. I am a bit of a perfectionist, and so I think to try and give myself less of a hard time and to like learn to live in the moment more and to enjoy what you've got now. And I think actually for all of us, like 2020, we've all had to kind of start to try and appreciate what's in front of us rather than what's ahead necessarily.
Cool. If you could study any other course at Brighton, what would it be?
So unfortunately, we don't do any courses in brewing or distilling because that would be my choice because I absolutely love craft beer. I think probably if I had to like just do something else, I'd probably look at something like primary education. Actually, I'd be really interested to learn about kind of teaching young kids and stuff. So yeah, and we've got great courses on that here. So yeah.
Can you pick a favourite place in Sussex?
Yes, I will always have a soft spot for Worthing because it's where I grew up. I've also lived there several years when I was an adult as well, and it's just kind of, I find it very calming being in Worthing. It's kind of reassuringly consistent and the same, and it's a very different vibe to Brighton. I love Brighton, I love living here, but there's something about Worthing that I find very soothing.
Tell us something about yourself that a lot of people may not know.
Okay. I struggle to think of this, but I suppose one thing I will admit to, and this is kind of related to the festive season, is that I am incredibly competitive at board games to the point where I'm banned playing them with my partner's family because I get too competitive and he finds it really embarrassing.
Are you a cheat, or do you always play by the rules?
No, that's the problem. I'm a real stickler for the rules,
Right.
and I think I make it all very stressful for everyone else involved. And so yeah, it doesn't bring out a good side of me, especially once I've had a couple of proseccos on Christmas Day. It's dark. So I've been banned from doing that now.
Finally, if you could invite 3 people to dinner, excluding family, so past or present, or fancy dinner party, who would they be and why?
Okay. Graham Norton. I think you always need someone who would kind of lubricate the conversation and get people talking and have lots of anecdotes, and obviously Graham Norton would be brilliant at that. I would also love to have Kylie Minogue, because I would really hope, she seems lovely, but also really hope that at the end of the night we would do karaoke together and I could sing with Kylie. And then also I'd quite like to have Macaulay Culkin come, because she's a brilliant writer, and I also think she's very funny as well, and I think she'd be like a nice kind of person to invite and meet and find more about. So yeah, those would be my dinner party guests.
Your dinner party. Holly, it's been great having you on. Really had a really fun time talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much. You had some brilliant questions, and yeah, we could probably both talk about this for much longer.
Yeah, I think so.
Maybe post-pandemic we'll have to.
Yeah, definitely. Look, remember, you can catch up with previous episodes anytime you like. There's a huge variety there. Please do share and leave a review on Apple Podcasts as well. Thanks for listening.